It's time for the second video of my analysis of Ori's soundtrack. Today we're exploring how nature and Ori's playful way to discover their spirituality through a versatile platforming in this nature is expressed in the music, with then a focus on the Ginso tree. It's not hard to guess, choosing forests as worlds is a way to celebrate nature. The elements are summoned, the materials too. There's air, water, fire, then wood, stone, sand, snow, ice. There's almost everything, and a large part of the color so distinctive of Gareth Coker's scores for Ori comes from the weight of the elements and materials which abound in the forests, which are so many gameplay possibilities, wind for Sorrow Pass, sand for the windswept wastes, and that we will find in the music. This is done by giving prominence to the woodwinds, especially the non-orchestral instruments like the bansuri, the low whistle, the recorder, and the percussion, whether they have definite pitches or not. They are added to a classical orchestra where woodwinds are still given pride of place, and to the voice. There is thus a first choice in the instrumentation, an illustrative function. The Ginso tree is actually a water source. The percussion will combine a dry sound, that of the dried trunk, and another more aquatic one, but I will come back to it in the third part of the video. The Valley of the Wind and Sorrow Pass emphasize the flute with a more relaxed embouchure technique, and numerous portamenti, easier and more common than with the concert flute. Finally, as we approach the Forlorn Runes, how can we not hear the ice in the piano octaves, and the swift trills in the high register that fade in and fade out? Moreover, the very particular use of leitmotifs, which, in addition to being for some associated with the character, an ID, also seem chosen sometimes for their own rhythmic and melodic material, implies that each zone does not necessarily have a theme of its own. If some motifs are linked to specific characters or IDs, one cannot even speak of a forest theme in Ori and the Will of the Wisps. It is thus necessary instead to turn to the rhythmic treatment of the themes and, again, the instrumentation to differentiate certain zones. And of course, the work of the instrumentalists will allow to define a phrasing to reinforce all that. For example, in Ori and the Will of the Wisps, the Lumapools and the Windswept Wastes share the same theme, which we hear in the prologue when Ku, Ori, Naru and Gumo play in winter. The Lumapools are a very pleasant place, where the color palette is undoubtedly the most vibrant, with cyan and pink, and which, despite the presence of the fall spirit, seems safe from decline from the moment the mill is working again to purify the waters. We notably see a lot of Mokis in this area. There is thus a form of bliss in the music of the zone by the choir, and the choice of rather precise instruments, percussion and recorder, especially with the very clear sound of the recorder very defined too. The Windswept Wastes, where the sand dunes never stop moving, will first use the English horn in a rather magical solo, which opens the music to a certain sensuality through the phrasing of Christine Negus, but I come back to that specific solo in the 5th video of this series, and then the flute, but not an orchestral flute nor a recorder. The sound and the phrasing are much more diffuse. It seems obvious that one of the functions of the music can be to accompany the gameplay, notably when this one is varied, and to signal the acquisition of new powers. It all depends on the game, of course. One can perceive a few touches in Hollow Knight, for example. I often have the impression, surely very subjective, that the bassoon's rhythmic cells in Green Path are a way to illustrate the increasing importance of jumps in the area's gameplay, but apart from that, the emphasis is on the narrative. However, in Ori it makes sense, and above all, this platforming is to a certain extent coupled with the heroes opening up to their spirit nature. This is what I want to discuss here. The platforming in Ori, and especially Ori and the Will of the Wisps, is sublimated by several original abilities, the bash, the launch, or organic ones, the grappling hook, but also other elements integrated in the design of the forest by the flowers which propel us, the moss to which we cling, the branches which can be used as a high bar. All these elements connect thanks to Ori's abilities, and some sequences are really exhilarating, especially with the bash. Ori, by opening to the spirit nature of their fellow spirits through the ancestral trees, can be one with it in a way. They discover, in a playful way, forests which may however be a priori dangerous or associated with painful events, the death of Naru, the separation with Ku, and discover at the same time their nature as a spirit, which first gives them powers, then confronts them with their destiny. I will come back to it in the following video. I find that this connection to their fellow spirits, from which they remain distant, and this way of unconsciously accepting their spirituality through the powers of the deceased spirits, is expressed the most in the music that follows our acquiring the last ability in Ori and the Blind Forest, completing the circle which forms with Riding the Wind a very nice diptych. The gameplay in the first part of Sorrow Pass is passive, since it is essentially based on the feather, which acts as a small parachute or a paraglider. Moreover, this is the area that follows the second dungeon. After this trying moment, one needs a breather, like in the area from the Thornfeld Swamp that is explored just after the Ginza Tree. The flute illustrates in its own way this passivity, this relative gentleness of letting yourself be carried by the winds. The first arpeggio, certainly dynamic, is not too active, and immediately afterwards the solo melody will take the time to settle. There are only 2 intervals in the introduction, played with a generous portamento, as if the flute were letting itself be carried by its own breath, letting the note evolve on its own towards the next one. The low strings then bring a form of tension that is immediately swept away by the appearance of numerous flute cells, repeated again and again. One in particular has a melodic ostinato, another presents repeated A's. The strings accompany the upward movement of the gameplay. The idea in the zone is to break platforms so that the winds can rush through Sorrow Pass and bring us to its summit where the Sunstone is. And here again the phrasing is free, relaxed, soaring. The flute cells bring just the right amount of structure and there's a discrete but unperturbed pulse on the percussion. The solo flute comes back, but it too gives in, partially, to the temptation of the ostinato. It repeats the same motifs, almost as if it were improvising from given cells that could be played ad libitum, short, simple cells that systematically end on descending intervals, often the same interval, by the way, F-sharp E, which also acts as a kind of ostinato. We lose ourselves with languor in all these elements that always come back. The low strings envelop the sound of the flutes, at first discreetly, then they assert themselves. This announces the second part, completing the circle. The sound of the low strings can easily induce a certain tension, simply by the color they have in this register, the depth of the sound when cellos and double basses play together, and the phrasing here very different from that of the flutes, harder, more concrete. You can't have, with such a mass of sound, the liberty of a more solo phrasing. The piano, taking up the main theme, slightly softens the strings before the solo flute comes back, a little more active than before because the melody develops more frankly, while keeping this freedom in the interpretation. After a short transition, a commentary on the piano, the initial elements return and the softness of the ostinatos seems to get lost, too, in the winds of Sorrow Pass. The second part of the gameplay, shorter, is much more dynamic, more active. We acquire the last power, the charge jump, that not only propels us in several directions, but also allows us to break some platforms or specific walls. Of course, we obtain a power, the last one. It is thus necessary to translate the imminence of the end of the adventure. Also, Ori, from now on, can move in all the forests. They're completely free. Nibble, which was hostile a few hours ago, is now entirely within their reach. Their nature of spirit, unknown to them for a long time, is going to express itself in a vibrant way by the freedom of the phrasing of the flute. We immediately feel a form of urgency. Unlike the previous piece, Riding the Wind, the pulse is present immediately and the flute's gesture is more active. We can even hear on the long F sharp a more dynamic breath effect, like a slow but intense vibrato. We even hear a half tone, before getting lost in a very light descending portamento. The solo unfolds on very rhythmic low strings. I like very much the use of the pitch to bring some tension. The E, for example, is a bit sharp, a bit empty. Its color is different. The timbre brings a lot of intensity. The same effect is done on other long notes, the G, for example. The grace notes are also played with more dynamism, almost a form of urgency, an urgency that will finally lead to the explosion of the solo supported by the piano and the sound design of the charge jump. The phrasing of this solo is simply sublime. The first element, an ascending motion, sounds endless. The G in particular, which comes out of the F sharp and then gets lost. Then there's the freedom of the ornaments, their volubility sometimes, and again the use of the pitch on the C, again quite sharp, like an intense inspiration. This part of the gameplay is very short. You can reach the summit and hear the loop only once, and the tension is already falling. The motifs are taken up again, but the intensity disappears quickly. The summit is within our reach. After that, we come back to the initial theme, Riding the Wind. We hear completing the circle only once as a way to mean how important this last power is. It would be too intense to hear it all the time, even if it's very beautiful. The absolute freedom of the little spirits, the connection to their spirituality through the powers of their dead siblings come together with the urgency, that of the forest, of its decline, and also that of Ori, since this adventure makes them grow up maybe a bit too fast. Since this forest is a way for the little spirit to express their agility and the powers of their fellow creatures that they now embody, there's also in the music this intention to underline the deeply tactile aspect of the places. The sound design already did it, of course, but it was in connection with the elements, the materials, the foley and the wood, notably in Ori and the Will of the Wisps, what I evoked previously. But the sound results from the interaction, from a gesture made on the material, and sometimes it seems that it is Ori who plays with it, notably in the introduction of the Jinzo tree, where the almost improvised percussion could be due to Ori if they were having fun playing on the trunk inside the tree. The richness of the percussion and their attacks accompany the evocation of the elements, but underline even more the tangible, tactile aspect of the places, the interaction, just like the very specific sound that we will hear throughout the whole part with Quoloc from the moment we enter his hollow. And who wins at this game with the elements? For me, no doubt, it is the very first dungeon. My favorite area, although the Wellspring and Mount Horu are great dungeons too, but because that's where you get the bash, and I love the bash, and because the escape music was one of those moments where you discover a piece that you're going to be obsessed with for a long time, like Green Path in Hollow Knight, Apotheosis in Journey, or the last movement of Brahms's Violin Concerto. It is an important dungeon for Ori because the bash will fundamentally change their way of moving in the world and challenging the enemies. They will be able to actually attack them without saying by sending back their projectiles, and we will rather tend to go towards them to take advantage of the bash and move faster than to avoid them and let Sane attack. It is a step in this forest, Nibel being itself a metaphor for this childhood lived in fast forward by Ori. The Jinzo tree is located in Thornfeld Swamp, whose music uses mainly two themes, the one from the Sunken Glades, revealed in the prologue when we discover Swallow's Nest after the decline, treated here in a rather dark way, with notably a quite haunting tonic pedal, a low C, with the bass clarinet I would say, I hear a lot of woodwinds in this part, that comes back again and again. This first minute, almost distressing, is immediately softened by the return of Ori's initial theme, the leaf theme, which will be one of the important elements of the Jinzo tree, after a beautiful transition which comes to pacify the sound, as if it was a little corrupted. Particularly, the strings come to accompany the theme with a counterpoint with a magnificent texture. The initial, ominous elements return but are again soothed, this time by the oboe. It sounds as if it is taking up a variation of the theme from the Sunken Glades. There is a strange balance between the softness of the theme, although it has a certain melancholy, the softness of Tom Boyd's phrasing, and the sound is so soft that it almost sounds as if it's English horn rather than oboe. The softness of some of the percussion, as always the work on percussion is exemplary, and the initial material completely focused on the tonic, which never really disappears. This is in contrast to the music that accompanied our chase with Gumo in the previous sequence, before the dungeon, which was mischievous. Just a bit. But we have recovered the water vein, and we can now enter the Ginso tree. This is a dungeon based on jumps, coupled with a bash, and whose level design doesn't necessarily require lightning reflexes, but rather a good reading of the teleporters and a certain serenity in said jumps. Everyone will feel its difficulty to a different degree, but it is designed in a progressive and rather structured way. The musical color of this dungeon will combine wood, water, and air. We start with a short introduction, obviously focused on percussion, opening on a very precise musical gesture, marking the beginning of something important. It seems almost that the sound bursts, something opens, leaving place to rhythmic gestures that sound improvised, highlighted by another rhythm, a regular one, the F sharp. Everything is there, the different sound colors. We start with wood and water on different levels with, as I had evoked a little earlier, this very tactile character of the wood here, as if Ori was improvising themselves on the inside of the trunk of this tree now completely dry, the discovery of the forest, leaving room for a game with nature. There is also this deeply organic aspect by the emphasis on the fifth B F sharp, thus harmonics, and the light glissando which tries to make the F sharp come out and bring it to the G or even higher. One of Ori's motifs, the one from the leaf, is used as a call. We're familiar with it at that time since it's used in the music from the Thornfell Swamp. The pulse then gently appears and settles with a quiet ostinato just as the theme begins. A new element, air, is added. This theme is not new. One recognizes the second part of the initial theme of the prologue. Here it develops always with tranquility. The dungeon is not too difficult and it is a really separate zone where Ori can finally put to good use everything they learned from the ancestral trees. The next minute is dedicated to a long transition. On an ostinato of repeated beats, the Jinzu tree seems to continue its awakening with the percussion. A similar effect will be heard in the Wellspring watermill, while the strings have a rather limited role. The transition induces a certain tension that will lead us to the second big thematic element of the dungeon, an ascending scale that will be found later in moments of tension, the escapes usually, but also in a much softer way in the last part of the DLC. This element works in cycles. It is based on a natural B minor scale or an Aeolian mode as often, so there is no leading tone and less tension. The sequence starts on a B 4 times, then C sharp, D and E, and it starts again, now supporting the first theme, the leaf theme. The instrumentation fleshes out, the theme of spirituality is taken up again, repeated. If the Jinzu tree wakes up, the dungeon is also the opportunity for Ori to open up to their spirituality and to put themselves to the test. This thematic element, the scales, lends itself well to this dungeon, which is certainly completely vertical, but cyclical through the use of teleporters, and despite the tension induced by this theme, necessary to accompany the platforming's increasing difficulty, there is in all the music of the Jinzu tree a great tranquility. There are notably these moments of pause, like a gentle commentary with the piano octaves very slightly shifted. To avoid repeating the same loop, there are several loops, each one starting at a key moment in the structure of the dungeon. There is the initial loop. It loops completely, so we find all the introduction, the start of the pulse, each time. After the first mini-boss, which has its own music, there is another loop, similar to the first one, but not quite, which allows several things. I'll come back to that in a few seconds. The next door gives us access to the bash, and bash means new loop. There is one more for the second mini-boss, then the post-bash loop starts again, but the audio file is different, while we free the tree's heart from its corruption, and finally, the escape loop. Each loop does not necessarily bring a new thematic element or even a fundamental break with what precedes it. However, this has several advantages. It necessarily introduces a form of variety rather than always hearing the same loop, therefore always the same elements with the same regularity. When an element is very distinctive, even if it's interesting, after a while, it can eventually lose part of its relevance. Just think of the introduction of the dungeon. It doesn't make sense to hear this beginning more than once or twice. Moreover, changing the loop after the mini-boss allows for a nice transition between the outro fanfare and the loop itself, this fanfare being also based on musical elements from the loop. obtaining the badge brings another thing. You have to get familiar with the new mechanics, so there is a new evolution of the gameplay difficulty. The loop has to change. The ascending scales disappear. It is, literally, the calm before the storm. Sail finally restores the element of waters, a very bright fanfare which mostly highlights an E major chord before returning to the main key, B minor, is superimposed on the usual thunder sound design to illustrate the power of the spirit light. As the corruption is gone, the heart can once again filter all the waters of Nibel, which then rush into the Jinzu tree, carrying everything up to the top, including Ori. The music explodes, accompanied by the almost deafening sound design of the water and the bash. This music is going to mix a relentless rhythm and a very strong lyricism. Ori finds themselves in an intense, spectacular situation, a race against time at the risk of their own life, but in a natural, organic place. It's the first real moment when all that they learn from the forest, thanks to the power of the other spirits locked in the ancestral trees, allows them to restore it. The escape loop takes up the elements previously heard in the Jinzu tree with a new treatment, precise, nervous even. The repeated Bs are now played in tremolo on the strings, and there are now only 2 ascending scales that loop like an infinite scale. The brass instruments are also very rhythmic, but the winds, the oboe in particular, take over to announce, then state, the main theme. Their softer tone allows the transition between the purely rhythmic introduction and what's coming next, more balance between the theme and the accompaniment. Still rhythmic, but necessarily more discreet, like a heartbeat, while a very simple counterpoint accompanies the main theme. It's only a simple descending motion, but it is played with so much intensity that it imposes itself over the theme. The balance between Ori's complaint and the need to escape is really perfect. The loop keeps going until you succeed. It's better that there is no interruption if you die. It's an extremely strong support for the player. The music just keeps flowing. The choir returns as you leave the tree, anticipating somewhat the function it will have in the second game, a commentary, here rather a kind accompaniment, a form of comfort as the main theme returns, with sounds evoking both wonderment and childhood. The respite is short-lived as Kuro shows herself. She hunts Ori just as she hunted the other spirits before. We find the usual musical markers of fear. The main theme accompanies one last time the fall of Ori while the choir seems to lament. Everything then closes on Kuro's last attack. As some areas are completely transformed after the escape or the boss fight, Ori's look on it can change, especially the purified waters in Nibel after they revive the element of waters at the heart of the Jinzo tree. They become also part of Ori's playground, and in The Waters Cleansed, we hear well this rediscovered joy of the little spirit. The return of the oboe is radiant, the theme has lost the intensity of the previous scene and underlines the innocence, even furtive, of the hero. We find again the evocation of the elements, here water. Ori is a game of emotions and, as we will see later in this series, very changeable emotions. Ori's supposed innocence is very quickly swept away by the thwarted discovery of the spirit light and the decline of the forest, among which they embody hope. At first fragile, they fail to save Naru, and then tireless, they save the whole forest. Then another one. Although they are surrounded, they are often seen alone because they lose their ties, certainly momentarily, submitted to trials of which they themselves are the key, finally accepting to sacrifice their humanity. Everything is never totally closed, since negative events are systematically compensated by positive ones, whether they are definitive or a more modest glimmer in the darkness. And although some reunions are unfortunately rather short or a nighttime exploration turns into a fight a little too quickly, hope always reappears. Take Howl's attack, for example. This boss fight, the very first in Ori and the Will of the Wisps, happens less than 10 minutes after the beginning of the gameplay. The magical atmosphere of the storm is disturbed by the arrival of a wolf with an imposing silhouette in the distance. A few moments later, already it's just behind us. This fight establishes the idea that Ori must now face the forest, here through Howl. It's not enough for them to flee anymore, they must answer. At the end of the escape, Ori gets hit, it's scripted, and the only way out is to fight back with the torch. The monkeys who appear in the background, they will follow Ori throughout the introduction, reinforce the position as a guardian that this fight confers to the hero. The introduction of the fight, very short, also emphasizes the new role of the choir in the score and its more elaborate treatment. I will come back to this in one of the following videos, the one about narration, so the 5th video. The choir is a musical personification of the forest, which would here cry out in fear, an instinctive reaction to the situation. In the loop itself, at times the strings and the choir seem almost to merge. At the opposite end of the spectrum, there is a darker orchestral color, an arpeggio repeated over and over again in a very clear rhythmic framework, just like Howl's attacks. But an ascending motion comes to illuminate the scene as the Maquis, still perched on their stone structures, must recognize in Ori the promised savior, the new light of Naiwen. One of the key elements in this expression of hope is the pulse, usually given lightly to rather soft-sounding percussion instruments with definite pitch, in contrast to more lyrical moments without any audible pulse. It is the case when Ori acquires the Spirit Blade, obviously. I had spoken about it in my very first video on Ori. Or a little earlier at the beginning of the gameplay, when the piano arpeggios signals the beginning of the loop after the duet with the solo strings, violoncello probably. It is time for Ori to advance. The Spirit Light, announcing a possible renewal with Ku, is welcomed in the same way. Even in the boss fights, after all, if this pulse can be understood as the expression of the strength of the opponents for Mora or Shriek, it also triggers the moments when Ori seems to free themselves from their grip. In the wellspring, as the pulse appears, although it's connected to the function of the building itself, it's also important for Ori. As we have the wellspring turning again, we'll be able to find Ku in the Silent Woods. The pulse is also sometimes the expression of a form of wonderment, as when we acquire the power in Boar's territory, and that the percussion, well suited to this winter, which warms a little, appear finally. From a purely instrumental point of view, it is the use of the vibrato that often strikes me. Obviously, we will never use the same vibrato on every music we play, and often in Ori, it is a rather generous vibrato that will tend to open the note and make it sound a little sharper. I think in particular of the solo strings. The tones of the instrumentalists are generally very lively, and I probably said it before and I will say it again, there's especially this color of the strings, deep but always very generous. Two genres stand out in this nature. A first one that we call in French merveilleux, typical in tales, and another darker one, of which Naiwen in particular emphasizes some of the aspects, the fantastique. That'll be the theme for next video. I hope I'll be able to publish it soon. In the meantime, thanks for watching and goodbye.